Lenora Ashford was standing at the edge of the flooded quarry when she understood that her grandfather had left her something far more valuable than anyone could see. The water was black as ink, still as death, and deep enough to swallow secrets that had waited decades to be told. The quarry stretched 70 feet across and 80 feet long, a rectangular wound carved into the New Hampshire granite by men who had worked these hills when the stone trade was young and profitable. The walls dropped straight down, sheer faces of gray rock that caught the October sunlight and held it like captured silver. At the surface, autumn leaves floated in lazy circles, red and gold against the darkness below. But Lenora was not looking at the leaves. She was looking at what lay beneath them, hidden under 35 feet of accumulated rainwater and neglect. Her brother Tobias stood beside her, thinner than he should have been at 18, his dark hair falling across eyes that never stopped reading the world like it was a book he could not put down. He held their grandfather's leather journal against his chest, the one Ezekiel Ashford had kept for 40 years, filled with drawings and calculations and observations that most people would have dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone with rocks. Tobias did not dismiss anything their grandfather had written. He had read every page 3 times since the funeral. 3 months had passed since they buried Ezekiel Ashford in the small cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Ironstone Valley. 3 months of lawyers and documents and distant relatives who appeared from nowhere to claim pieces of an estate that amounted to very little. A cabin that needed a new roof, 40 acres of forest that produced nothing but firewood, and this quarry, this flooded pit that everyone in the valley called worthless. Everyone except the man whose carriage was now rolling up the dirt road toward them, dust rising behind the wheels like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Lenora recognized the carriage before she could see the driver. Black lacquered wood with brass fittings that gleamed in the sun. 2 matching gray horses that cost more than most families in the valley earned in 5 years. She had seen this carriage before, parked outside the finest houses in Concord, on a waiting while its owner conducted business that always seemed to leave other people poorer than they had been before. Harlan Voss stepped down from the carriage with the careful precision of a man who measured every movement for maximum effect. He was 55 years old, but he moved like someone younger, someone who had never done physical labor because he had always found ways to make other people do it for him. His hair was silver at the temples, dark everywhere else, slicked back with pomade that smelled of bergamot and money. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with a gold watch chain crossing his vest like a line drawn between his world and everyone else's. He was smiling. Lenora hated that smile. She had seen it at her grandfather's funeral. Stretched across Voss's face while he offered condolences that meant nothing, and studied the mourners with eyes that calculated what each of them might be worth. A younger man followed Voss from the carriage, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of someone who was paid to look serious at all times. His name was Whitfield, and he was a lawyer, though Lenora suspected he was the kind of lawyer who helped people do things that decent lawyers refused to do. Voss approached the edge of the quarry and stood there for a moment, looking down at the water with an expression that Lenora could not read. Then he turned to face her and Tobias, and the smile widened into something that might have been warm if it had reached his eyes. "Miss Ashford? Young Mr. Ashford." He nodded to each of them in turn, his voice carrying the polished tones of someone who had practiced sounding sincere. "I was hoping to find you here. I came to pay my respects to your grandfather's memory, and to make you an offer that I believe will benefit everyone involved." Lenora did not respond. She had learned from Ezekiel that silence was often more powerful than words, that letting other people talk revealed more about them than asking questions ever could. Voss waited for her to speak. When she did not, he continued without missing a beat. "I know this must be a difficult time for you both. Losing your grandfather, facing an uncertain future, trying to make sense of an inheritance that presents more challenges than opportunities." He gestured toward the quarry, the movement encompassing the black water and the sheer walls and the emptiness that seemed to stretch forever beneath the surface. "This quarry, for example, it was productive once, I understand, 20 years ago, perhaps more, but the vein ran thin, the water table rose, and now it produces nothing but mosquitoes and memories." "It produces granite," Tobias said quietly. "The granite is still there." Voss's smile flickered, just for a moment, something passing behind his eyes that might have been annoyance or might have been satisfaction at drawing the boy into conversation. The granite is underwater, young man. It might as well be on the moon for all the good it does anyone. Water can be moved. By whom? With what resources? Voss shook his head, the gesture full of practiced sympathy. You are young, Mr. Ashford. You see possibilities where practical men see impossibilities. It is an admirable quality, but it does not pay for food or shelter or the simple necessities of survival. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, which he handed to Whitfield, who opened it and removed a single sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting. I am prepared to offer you $120 for this quarry and the 10 acres immediately surrounding it, Voss said. Cash, payable immediately, with no conditions or encumbrances. Mr. Whitfield has prepared the documents. You could sign today and walk away with money in your pockets, free from the burden of maintaining a property that will never produce anything of value. $120. Lenora felt the number settle into her chest like a stone. $120 for the land their grandfather had worked for 40 years. $120 for the quarry he had believed in so strongly that he had refused to sell even when the water rose and the other quarrymen abandoned the valley. $120 for everything Ezekiel Ashford had left them. Our grandfather paid $600 for this quarry, she said. Her voice was steady, but something cold was spreading through her veins, something that felt like anger, but cut deeper than anger ever could. He paid $600 23 years ago, when the granite trade was strong and this quarry was producing blocks that built half the government buildings in Concord. And now it produces nothing, Voss replied smoothly. Markets change. Values change. And what was worth $600 then is worth considerably less now. I am offering you a fair price for a property that no one else will buy at any price. How do you know no one else will buy it? The question came from Tobias, and it made Voss pause. Not long, just a fraction of a second, but Lenora saw it. Because I have made inquiries, Voss said, because I understand this market better than anyone in the valley, because I am trying to help you avoid the mistake of holding on to something that will only drag you down. Lenora looked at her brother. Tobias was staring at Voss with an expression she recognized, the expression he wore when he was reading a book and discovering that the story was not what he had expected it to be. Our grandfather mentioned you in his journal, Tobias said slowly. He wrote about you quite often. Actually, he called you his former partner. Something changed in Voss's face. The smile remained, but the warmth behind it disappeared entirely, replaced by something flat and watchful. Your grandfather and I had business dealings many years ago, Voss admitted. We parted ways over differences in philosophy. I bore him no ill will, and I hope he bore me none. He wrote that you forged his signature on 3 contracts, Tobias continued, his voice still quiet, still calm, as if he were reading from a history book rather than accusing a powerful man of crimes. He wrote that you used those contracts to seize 3 quarries that belonged to him. He wrote that he tried to take you to court, but the judge dismissed the case because you had paid him to do so. Enough! Voss's voice cracked across the clearing like a whip, sharp enough to make Whitfield flinch. For a moment the mask slipped entirely, and Lenora saw what was underneath. Cold rage, calculated fury, the face of a man who had built his fortune on other people's losses and would not tolerate being reminded of how he had done it. Then the smile returned, smaller now, tighter at the edges. Your grandfather was a bitter old man who could not accept that he had made poor business decisions, Voss said quietly. He spent 20 years blaming me for his own failures. I had hoped that his grandchildren might be more reasonable, but I see that the apple does not fall far from the tree. He straightened his coat, a precise movement that seemed to reset something inside him. The offer stands at $120. I will give you 1 week to consider it. After that, the price drops to $60, and after that, he paused, looking at the quarry, then back at Lenora with eyes that held no warmth at all. After that, I will simply wait. You cannot survive the winter out here, Miss Ashford. You have no money, no resources, no skills that will keep you fed when the snow falls. By February, You will come to me begging to take this worthless pit off your hands, and I will oblige you, but the price will be considerably less than what I am offering today." He turned and walked back toward his carriage, Whitfield hurrying to follow. At the door of the carriage, Voss paused and looked back. "Your grandfather was a fool," he said. "He died protecting a flooded hole that will never produce anything of value. I hope you are wise enough not to follow his example." The carriage rolled away, leaving dust and silence in its wake. Lenora stood at the edge of the quarry, watching until the carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she turned to her brother. "He knows something," she said. Tobias nodded. "He knows exactly what is at the bottom of this quarry. That is why he wants it so badly." They looked down at the black water together, two orphans standing at the edge of something that everyone else had dismissed as worthless, wondering what secrets their grandfather had left them to discover. The cabin their grandfather had built sat on a small rise overlooking the quarry, close enough that you could hear the wind moving across the water on quiet nights, far enough that the morning fog did not reach the windows until nearly sunrise. It was small, 3 rooms arranged in a line, and with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen at the other. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the floorboards creaked in ways that told stories about decades of footsteps, but it was solid in the ways that mattered. Ezekiel Ashford had built it himself, stone by stone, and he had built it to last. Lenora stood in the main room that evening, sorting through the boxes they had brought from their aunt's house in Portsmouth. Their parents had died of cholera 6 years earlier, carried off in the same epidemic that had swept through the coastal cities in 1849, leaving 2 children and nothing else behind. Their aunt had taken them in out of obligation rather than affection, and she had made it clear from the beginning that they were burdens she carried rather than family she cherished. When Ezekiel Ashford had written to offer them a home, Lenora had read the letter 3 times before she believed it was real. A grandfather they had barely known, living alone in the New Hampshire mountains, inviting them to come and stay as long as they wanted. Their aunt had practically pushed them out the door, and Lenora had not looked back as the coach carried them away from the only home they had known since their parents died. That had been 4 years ago. 4 years of learning how to live in the mountains. 4 years of watching their grandfather work the land, tend his small garden, walk the boundaries of his property every morning as if he were measuring something only he could see. 4 years of listening to his stories about the quarry, about the granite trade, about the fortune that lay waiting at the bottom of a flooded pit for someone with the vision to retrieve it. Lenora had loved him with the fierce gratitude of someone who had been rescued from a life of cold charity and given something real in its place. He had taught her how to manage a household, how to plan for hard winters, how to read people's faces for the lies they tried to hide. He had treated her as an adult when everyone else saw only a young woman who should be looking for a husband. He had believed in her in ways that no one else ever had. And then, 3 months ago, he had died in his sleep, leaving her and Tobias alone in the world again. Tobias was sitting at the table near the fire, surrounded by the books their grandfather had left behind. There were dozens of them, leather-bound volumes on geology and engineering and architecture, filled with diagrams and equations that Lenora could not begin to understand. See, Tobias understood them. Tobias had always understood things that other people found impossible, had taught himself to read at 5 and to solve mathematical problems at 7, and to discuss scientific principles with adults while still a child. Their grandfather had recognized this gift immediately. He had given Tobias access to his entire library, had spent hours discussing concepts and theories, had treated the boys' questions with the seriousness they deserved. In return, Tobias had absorbed everything their grandfather could teach him, storing it away in a mind that seemed to have no limits on what it could hold. Now Tobias was reading their grandfather's journal again, turning pages carefully, his forehead creased in concentration. He knew about the drainage, Tobias said without looking up. He documented everything. And the water level in the quarry drops by approximately 2 inches every month during dry seasons. It rises during wet seasons. But over time, the net flow is outward. There is a crack somewhere in the eastern wall, below the current waterline, where the water is seeping into a lower aquifer. Lenora set down the shirt she had been folding. How does that help us? If we can find that crack and widen it, we can drain the quarry. The water table beneath the quarry is lower than the quarry floor. Given sufficient drainage capacity, the entire pit could be emptied in 6 to 8 weeks. And then what? We have an empty pit instead of a flooded one. Tobias finally looked up, and something in his eyes reminded Lenora so strongly of their grandfather that her breath caught in her throat. The pit is 35 feet deep, he said. The walls are solid granite, sheer on all sides. At the bottom, according to grandfather's notes, the floor is flat and level, cut that way deliberately so the quarry blocks would sit properly before being lifted out. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Do you know what temperature it is at the bottom of a granite pit that deep? No. 52 degrees. Summer or winter, day or night. 52 degrees, because granite holds temperature like nothing else on Earth. The earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature, and the stone walls of the quarry trap that temperature inside. Lenora stared at him. You are suggesting that we live in the quarry? I am suggesting that we build a shelter at the bottom of the quarry. Walls of granite blocking wind from every direction, a floor that never freezes. Natural temperature regulation that requires no fuel to maintain. In the worst winter, while people in the valley are burning cord after cord of wood just to stay alive, we would be comfortable with a fraction of the fuel. People will think we have lost our minds. People already think that. Tobias smiled, a rare expression that transformed his serious face into something almost mischievous. Voss called grandfather a fool for believing in this quarry, but grandfather understood something that Voss will never understand. He saw the quarry not as a hole to be exploited, but as a shelter to be built. He just ran out of time before he could prove it. Lenora sat down across from her brother, looking at the journal in his hands, at the pages covered in their grandfather's careful handwriting. Can we really do this? She asked. Drain the quarry? Build something at the bottom? Survive the winter? I do not know, Tobias admitted, but I know that if we do nothing, Voss wins. He takes the quarry for a fraction of its value, drains it himself, and sells the granite for thousands of dollars. Everything grandfather worked for disappears, and we spend the rest of our lives knowing that we gave it away. He closed the journal and held it out to her. Grandfather left us everything we need, the knowledge, the plans, the property itself. He just could not do the work anymore. He was waiting for us to be old enough to do it ourselves. Lenora took the journal, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the leather worn smooth by decades of handling. She thought about their grandfather, working this quarry when he was young and strong, watching the water rise as he grew old, believing until his last breath that someone would eventually see what he had seen. She thought about Voss, with his expensive suit and his cold eyes and his offer of $120 for a lifetime of work and dreams. She thought about what it would mean to give up, to take the money, to walk away and admit that everyone who had dismissed her and Tobias as foolish orphans had been right all along. And she made her decision. We need to find grandfather's friend, she said, the one he mentions in the journal, the stonemason who helped him build the original quarry works. Solomon Birch, Tobias said, nodding. Grandfather writes about him often. He says Solomon understands stone better than anyone he ever met. Do you know where to find him? Grandfather's notes say he lives in a cabin at the eastern edge of the valley, near the old mill pond. He stopped working in the quarries years ago, when his back gave out, but he still lives there, alone. Lenora stood up, tucking the journal under her arm. Then we start tomorrow, she said. We find Solomon Birch, and we ask him to help us drain the quarry and build a shelter at the bottom. And we prove that everyone who ever called grandfather a fool was wrong. They found Solomon Birch the following morning, sitting on a stump behind a cabin that looked like it had been built from salvaged materials and held together by stubbornness alone. He was 68 years old, according to their grandfather's journal, but he looked older, his hair completely white, and his face carved with lines that spoke of decades spent working in sun and wind and cold. His skin was dark brown and weathered to the texture of old leather, and his hands were enormous, scarred across every surface by decades of working stone. He did not look up when they approached, even though their footsteps were clearly audible on the carpet of fallen leaves. He was carving something, a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a bird, and his knife moved with a precision that belied his age. Solomon Birch? Lenora asked. Depends on who is asking. Lenora Ashford, Ezekiel Ashford's granddaughter. This is my brother Tobias. The knife stopped moving. Solomon looked up and his eyes were sharp despite the wrinkles surrounding them, sharp enough to make Lenora feel like she was being measured against some standard she could not see. Ezekiel's grandchildren, he said slowly. He talked about you. Said you were smart, both of you. He said the boy had a mind like nothing he had ever seen. He talked about you too, Tobias said. He said you understood stone better than anyone. Solomon grunted, returning his attention to the carving. Your grandfather understood stone better than I ever did. I just knew how to cut it. He knew how to listen to it. We need your help, Lenora said. I figured. Nobody comes out here unless they need something. We want to drain the quarry. The knife stopped again. This time Solomon set it down entirely and looked at them with an expression that Lenora could not read. Drain the quarry, he repeated. Tobias has been studying grandfather's journals. There is a crack in the eastern wall where the water is already seeping through. If we can widen it, create a proper drainage channel, we can empty the quarry in 6 to 8 weeks. And then what? We build a shelter at the bottom. Use the granite walls for protection against the wind. Use the constant temperature of the stone for warmth. Grandfather designed it all. He just never had the chance to build it. Solomon was silent for a long moment. Lenora could hear birds calling in the trees, the distant sound of water running somewhere nearby, the creak of branches moving in the autumn wind. Your grandfather talked about that shelter for years, Solomon finally said. He showed me his drawings, explained his calculations. I told him it was brilliant, and I told him it was difficult beyond measure. Why difficult? Because draining that quarry would take months of backbreaking work. Because building at the bottom would require skills that most people do not have. Because the whole plan depends on everything going right, and nothing ever goes right. One hard rain at the wrong time, and the quarry fills back up. One structural failure, and whoever is at the bottom gets buried under 1,000 tons of rock. He picked up the knife again, but he did not resume carving. He just held it, turning it over in his scarred hands. I told your grandfather all of this, he continued. I told him the risks were too great. And do you know what he said? Lenora shook her head. He said the risks of doing nothing were greater. He said that someday someone would need that shelter. Someday there would be a winter so hard that people would die without it. He said he would rather build something that might save lives than do nothing and watch people freeze. Solomon looked at them, really looked at them, and something in his expression softened. He was a stubborn old fool, he said quietly, and he was the best man I ever knew. Will you help us? The question hung in the air between them. Lenora watched Solomon's face, trying to read the thoughts moving behind his eyes, trying to understand what calculations he was making about whether 2 young orphans were worth the risk of one more difficult project. I cannot work like I used to, he said finally. My back will not allow it. My hands shake too badly to hold a chisel properly. Most days I can barely make it from my bed to this stump and back again. We will do the physical work. We just need you to tell us how. And when the whole valley laughs at you for listening to a broken-down old man and 2 young people who think they can drain a quarry, let them laugh. A grandfather believed this was possible, and we believe it too. Solomon was quiet again, studying them with those sharp old eyes. Then slowly he smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible beneath his weathered face, but it was real. Your grandfather left something for you, he said. He gave it to me 3 years ago, told me to hold on to it until his grandchildren came asking for help with the quarry. He said I would know when the time was right. He stood up, moving carefully, his hand pressed against his lower back. Lenora watched him walk to the cabin door, disappear inside, and return a moment later carrying a rolled bundle of papers tied with string. Plans, he said, handing them to Tobias. Detailed drawings of everything. The drainage channel, the foundation work, the shelter design, the chimney system. Every calculation, every measurement, every step of the process from start to finish. Tobias untied the string with trembling fingers and unrolled the papers. Lenora looked over his shoulder and saw pages covered in their grandfather's handwriting, diagrams that showed cross-sections of the quarry, elevation drawings of buildings that did not yet exist, He knew, Tobias whispered. He knew we would come. He believed you would come, Solomon corrected. There is a difference. Knowing is certainty. Believing is faith. Your grandfather had more faith than anyone I ever met. He sat back down on his stump, picking up the knife and the wooden bird. Come back tomorrow morning, he said, early before sunrise. We will start by finding that crack in the eastern wall. If we can locate it, if we can reach it, then maybe, just maybe, this difficult plan of yours might actually work. Lenora wanted to say something, wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded, and Solomon nodded back, and nothing else needed to be said. They walked back toward their cabin through the autumn woods. The plans rolled under Tobias's arm, their grandfather's dream finally beginning to take shape. Lenora and Tobias are about to attempt something that everyone in the valley believes is impossible. They are young, inexperienced, and facing a winter that could kill them if they fail. If you were in their position, would you take the risk, or would you take Voss's money and walk away? Think about your answer before we continue. The crack was exactly where the journal said it would be. Lenora found it on the morning of October 15th, hanging from a rope over the eastern edge of the quarry, while Tobias called directions from above. The water level was 8 inches lower on this side, just as the journal had noted, and the reason was visible once you knew where to look. A fissure in the granite face, barely wide enough to fit 3 fingers, running diagonally from 3 feet below the waterline down to somewhere beneath the surface. Water trickled through it constantly, seeping from the quarry into the rock beyond, draining toward some underground reservoir that Ezekiel Ashford had described in careful detail. I see it, Lenora called up. It is exactly where Grandfather said. Can you reach it? She braced her feet against the granite face and leaned out as far as the rope would allow. Her fingers touched cold stone, traced the edge of the crack. I felt the water flowing through it like blood through a vein. I can reach it, but it is too narrow. We will need to widen it considerably before it can drain anything significant. Solomon's voice drifted down from above, where he sat on a boulder watching them work. Your grandfather calculated that the crack would need to be at least 18 inches wide to drain the quarry before winter. That means removing approximately 4 cubic feet of granite per day for 6 weeks. How do we remove granite without proper tools? You have tools. Your grandfather left everything you need in the storage shed behind the cabin. Pickaxes, chisels, hammers, wedges. He was preparing for this work himself before his body gave out. Lenora let Tobias pull her back up to the rim, her arms aching from the strain of hanging over the edge. She sat on the ground, breathing hard, looking at the black water that covered everything they were trying to reach. The water level will drop as we work, Solomon continued. Each day, as you widen the crack, more water will drain. Within 2 weeks, you should be able to work from inside the quarry rather than hanging from ropes. And the cold? The water is cold, yes, but granite work keeps you warm. You will sweat more than you shiver, I promise you that. They began the next morning, before sunrise, while the valley was still wrapped in darkness and the first frost of the season sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Lenora had never swung a pickaxe before, had never felt the shock of steel against stone traveling up her arms and into her shoulders, had never known that rock could be so stubborn, so resistant, so absolutely unwilling to yield. By noon on the first day, she had removed approximately 1 cubic inch of granite. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders screamed, and her entire body felt like it had been beaten with clubs. This is impossible, she gasped, sitting on the rim of the quarry with her feet dangling over the edge. At this rate, it will take us 10 years to widen that crack. Solomon laughed, a dry sound like leaves rustling in the wind. You are not cutting the stone. You are trying to fight it. Stone does not respond to force. Stone responds to understanding. He moved carefully to the edge and looked down at the crack Lenora had been attacking. Granite has grain, he said, like wood, but subtler. If you cut against the grain, you accomplish nothing. If you cut with the grain, the stone almost separates itself. Your grandfather could read granite like you read books. He could look at a face of rock and see exactly where it wanted to be cut. How do we learn to do that? Practice, observation, failure. Solomon smiled at her expression. Mostly failure. But failure teaches you things that success never can. The days blurred together into an endless rhythm of work and exhaustion. Lenora rose before dawn, ate a cold breakfast, and descended into the quarry on ropes that wore grooves into her palms despite the gloves she wore. She swung the pickaxe until her arms refused to lift it anymore, then switched to chisels and hammers, learning to read the subtle variations in the stone that told her where to strike and where to leave alone. Tobias worked beside her when his smaller frame allowed, chewing and spent the rest of his time studying their grandfather's journals, calculating drainage rates, planning the construction that would begin once the quarry was empty. He was not built for physical labor the way Lenora was, but his mind compensated for what his body lacked, finding solutions to problems before they arose, anticipating difficulties that Lenora would never have seen coming. Solomon came every day, sitting on his boulder at the rim, calling down instructions and encouragement in equal measure. He could not do the work himself, but his knowledge was invaluable, accumulated over 40 years of cutting stone in quarries across New Hampshire. He taught them how to identify stress fractures that might cause unexpected breaks. He taught them how to use wedges to split stone along its natural planes. And he taught them the rhythm of the work, the pace that allowed for maximum effort without destroying the body that had to return tomorrow and do it all again. By the end of the first week, the crack had widened to 6 inches. Water poured through it now, a constant stream that carried the sound of falling water deep into the earth below. The level in the quarry had dropped by nearly a foot, exposing new sections of the granite walls that had been underwater for a decade. By the end of the second week, the crack was 12 inches wide, and the water level had dropped 3 feet. Lenora could stand on the granite floor of the drainage channel now, working in water that only came up to her knees instead of hanging from ropes over the abyss. And then the accident happened. It was the 17th day. Tobias was working at the base of the drainage channel, widening the crack with a chisel and hammer, when the granite above him shifted. There was no warning. One moment he was striking stone, the next moment the world was falling. Lenora heard the crack before she saw it, a sound like thunder, deep and wrong, followed by the rumble of stone breaking free from stone. She turned in time to see a section of the quarry wall, perhaps 200 pounds of granite, sliding toward her brother. She screamed his name. Tobias looked up. His eyes went wide. He threw himself sideways, but not fast enough. The edge of the falling stone caught his leg, pinning him against the quarry floor. He cried out, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the walls and buried itself in Lenora's chest like a knife. She was beside him in seconds, one of her hands on the stone pulling with strength she did not know she possessed. The granite did not move. It was too heavy, too firmly wedged against the floor. Tobias was trapped, his face gray with pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Solomon!" she screamed. "Solomon, help!" The old man appeared at the rim of the quarry, moving faster than she had ever seen him move. He descended the zigzag path with reckless speed, nearly falling twice, reaching them in minutes that felt like hours. Together they levered the stone away. Solomon knew exactly where to place the iron bar, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to tell Lenora to pull her brother free. The stone shifted, rolled, and Tobias screamed again as his leg came loose. The leg was not broken. Solomon examined it carefully, his scarred hands gentle despite their size. And badly bruised, deeply cut, but not broken. Tobias would walk again, though not for several weeks. That night, Lenora sat beside her brother's bed, watching him sleep, and felt something she had not felt since their parents died. Despair. She had nearly lost him. Her brother, her only family, the person she had sworn to protect when their grandfather died. She had brought him to this quarry, convinced him to attempt this impossible project, and now he lay injured because of her decisions. Maybe Voss was right. Maybe this was foolishness. Maybe they should take whatever money they could get and walk away before someone died. Solomon found her sitting outside the cabin at midnight, staring at the quarry that had nearly killed her brother. "You are thinking about giving up," he said, "when I am thinking about whether my pride is worth my brother's life." Solomon sat beside her, his old joints creaking in protest. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I had a wife once, and 2 children. We were escaping from a plantation in Virginia, trying to reach the north. trying to find freedom. We traveled by night, hid by day, moved through territory where being caught meant death or worse. Lenora looked at him. He had never spoken about his past, not once in all the weeks she had known him. We were 2 days from the border when the slave catchers found us. My wife told me to take the children and run while she led them away. I did not want to leave her. I begged her to come with us. But she said that someone had to survive, and she chose for it to be us. His voice broke slightly, but he continued. She died so that we could live. And for years afterward, I wanted to give up. I wanted to stop fighting, stop building, stop trying. But I did not, because giving up would have made her sacrifice meaningless. She died believing that I would keep going. She died believing that I would build something worth living for. He turned to look at Lenora, his old eyes bright with tears. Your grandfather believed in you. He died believing that you would finish what he started. If you give up now, you are not just abandoning a project. You are abandoning everyone who ever believed in you. Lenora felt tears on her own face, tears she had not known were falling. What if Tobias had died? He did not die. He is alive and he will recover, and when he does, he will want to continue, because that is who he is. That is who you raised him to be. Solomon stood, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. Grief is natural. Fear is natural. But do not let them make your decisions for you. Make your decisions based on who you want to be, not on what you are afraid of. He walked back toward the cabin, leaving Lenora alone with the stars and the quarry and the choice she had to make. By morning, she had made it. They would continue. Tobias nearly died. Lenora wanted to give up. Solomon reminded her that giving up would betray everyone who believed in her. Have you ever faced a moment when you wanted to quit? What made you keep going? Think about your answer before we continue. Help arrived from an unexpected source 3 days after the accident. Gideon Hale was the blacksmith's son, 25 years old, with shoulders broad enough to carry timber and hands strong enough to bend iron. He had heard about the accident at the quarry, heard about the 2 orphans trying to do what everyone said was impossible, and he had come to see for himself. He found Lenora at the rim of the quarry, preparing to descend alone while Tobias recovered. You should not be doing this by yourself, he said. Lenora looked at him, the stranger who had appeared without invitation. And who are you to tell me what I should do? Someone who knows how to swing a hammer. Someone who has nothing better to do with his days. Someone who thinks what you are trying to accomplish is worth helping. She studied him for a long moment, looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden motive. She found none. Just a young man with honest eyes and calloused hands who seemed to mean exactly what he said. Why would you help us? You do not know us. I knew your grandfather. He commissioned ironwork from my father for years. He was always kind to me, always took time to explain what he was building and why. When he died, I felt like I had lost something important. Gideon looked at the quarry, at the work that Lenora had accomplished against all odds. He talked about this shelter, you know. He told me his grandchildren would finish it someday. He said they would need help, and he hoped good people would offer it. He turned back to Lenora, his expression serious. I am offering. She should have refused. She barely knew him. She had no reason to trust him. But something in his voice, something in the way he spoke about her grandfather, it made her believe that his offer was genuine. We cannot pay you. I did not ask for payment. The work is dangerous. I am not afraid of danger. People will talk. A young man helping 2 orphans? They will assume the worst. Gideon smiled, the first smile she had seen from him. Let them talk. I have never cared much about what people assume. He stayed. He worked beside Lenora every day, learning to cut stone under Solomon's guidance, lifting timber that would have taken 2 people to move, doing whatever needed to be done without complaint or hesitation. He did not try to take over. He did not treat her as less capable because she was a woman. He simply worked, and slowly, so slowly that Lenora barely noticed it happening, she began to trust him. And somewhere in the midst of that trust, something else began to grow. Armed by the 3rd week, Harlan Voss returned. He came in the late afternoon, when the autumn sun was slanting through the trees and painting everything gold. Lenora was at the bottom of the quarry, 20 feet below the rim now that the water had drained enough to expose the upper walls. She heard the carriage before she saw it, heard the jingle of harness and the rhythm of hooves that she had learned to recognize as belonging to Voss's matched gray horses. She climbed the path she and Gideon had carved into the quarry wall, emerging at the rim just as Voss stepped down from his carriage. He was not smiling this time. His face was set in hard lines, and his eyes moved across the quarry with an expression that might have been anger or might have been fear. Tobias appeared from the cabin, limping but mobile, the journal still in his hands. Solomon remained on his boulder, watching with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that silence was often the best weapon. Gideon stood beside Lenora, his presence solid and reassuring. "What have you done?" Voss demanded. "We drained the quarry," Lenora replied. "Or we are draining it. Another 3 weeks, and the floor will be exposed." "You had no right. We own this property, Mr. Voss. We have every right to do whatever we wish with it." Voss's jaw tightened. He looked at the quarry again, at the water level that was now 15 feet below where it had been when he made his offer, at the drainage channel that was clearly visible as a dark gash in the eastern wall. "I offered you fair money for this land," he said, his voice controlled but barely. "I tried to help you avoid making a mistake that will cost you everything. Your offer was an insult designed to take advantage of our grief and our ignorance. You know nothing about the value of land, girl. You know nothing about business or markets or the realities of surviving in this valley. I know that my grandfather spent 20 years believing in this quarry. I know that you tried to steal it from him, just like you stole everything else. I know that when this quarry is drained, the granite at the bottom will be worth 50 times what you offered us." Something flickered in Voss's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she knew so much, or recognition that his secrets were no longer as secret as he had believed. "Your grandfather filled your head with fantasies," he said. "And there is nothing at the bottom of that quarry except rock and mud. Then why do you want it so badly?" The question hung in the air. Voss did not answer it. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. "I am withdrawing my offer," he said finally. "Whatever happens from here is your own fault." He turned and walked back to his carriage, moving with the stiff precision of a man who was struggling to control his anger. At the carriage door, he paused and looked back. "You should have taken the money, Miss Ashford. Now you will lose everything, and I will not offer you a single dollar when you come begging at my door." The carriage rolled away, leaving silence in its wake. Solomon spoke from his boulder, his voice calm despite everything. "He is afraid now. He knows you have found the drainage, and he knows that once the quarry is empty, his leverage disappears." "Will he try to stop us?" Tobias asked. "He will try. Men like Voss do not give up easily, especially when they believe something belongs to them. Watch the quarry tonight. Watch it every night from now on." They took Solomon's warning seriously. Lenore and Tobias and Gideon took turns sleeping, one always awake and watching the quarry, listening for sounds that did not belong to the night. On the third night after Voss's visit, they heard them. Footsteps in the darkness. Multiple sets, moving carefully along the path that led to the quarry's edge. Lenora woke Gideon with a hand on his arm, and together they crept to the window of the cabin, watching shadows move against the starlit sky. 3 men, carrying shovels and pickaxes, moving toward the drainage channel with obvious purpose. Lenora felt cold fury flooding through her veins. She reached for the shotgun that had belonged to their grandfather, the one that had hung over the fireplace since they arrived, loaded but never fired. "Stay here," she whispered to Gideon. "I am coming with you." "Gideon, I am coming with you." They slipped out the back door of the cabin together, circling through the trees, approaching the quarry from opposite directions. The men were already at the drainage channel, already beginning to fill it with rocks and debris, working quickly and quietly to undo weeks of backbreaking labor. Lenora raised the shotgun and fired into the air. The sound split the night like thunder, echoing off the quarry walls, rolling across the valley like a declaration of war. The men froze, so turning toward the sound, their faces pale blurs in the darkness. "The next one will not go in the air," Lenora said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Leave now, and do not come back." Gideon emerged from the trees on the opposite side, carrying an iron bar that gleamed in the moonlight. The men looked at each other. Then they dropped their tools and ran, crashing through the underbrush, disappearing into the darkness from which they had come. Lenora stood at the edge of the quarry, the shotgun still raised, listening to the sounds of flight fade into silence. Her hands were shaking, her whole body was shaking, but she did not lower the gun until she was certain they were gone. Gideon appeared beside her, his face serious in the moonlight. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." She lowered the shotgun, suddenly aware of how heavy it was. "They were trying to fill in the drainage. Voss sent them." "I know." They spent the rest of the night repairing what little damage the men had done, removing the rocks they had thrown into the channel, making sure the water was still flowing freely into the depths below. By morning, the drainage was restored, and the water level had dropped another 6 inches. But something had changed between them. The shared danger, the trust required to face it together, had created something that neither of them could name. When Gideon's hand brushed against Lenora's as they worked, neither of them pulled away. The drainage was complete by the first week of November. Lenora stood at the bottom of the quarry for the first time, her boots sinking into mud that had been underwater for 10 years, looking up at walls of granite that rose 35 feet on every side. The scale of it was overwhelming. Standing at the rim, the quarry had seemed large. Standing at the bottom, it felt like a world unto itself. The floor was exactly as Solomon had described. Flat as a table, smooth as a floor, cut by quarrymen who had taken pride in their work even when no one would ever see it. The mud would dry and wash away in the coming rains. Beneath it, solid granite waited, patient as it had been patient for 1,000,000 years. "We did it," Tobias breathed, standing beside her. His voice was hushed, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "We drained it," Lenora corrected. "We have not done anything yet. The real work starts now." Solomon descended the path slowly, carefully, his hand on the rope rail they had installed to help with the steep sections. At the bottom, he stood in silence, looking at walls he had not seen in more than a decade. "I helped cut these faces," he said quietly. 40 years ago, when I was young and strong and foolish enough to think I would live forever. I stood on scaffolding and swung my hammer and watched blocks of granite the size of wagons break free from the mother rock and fall into waiting chains. It was dangerous work, and it killed men regularly, but it was the most satisfying work I ever did. He walked to the northern wall and placed his scarred hand against the stone, pressing his palm flat against granite that had been waiting in darkness for longer than any of them had been alive. "Your grandfather loved this place," he continued. "Not for the money the stone could bring, but for the stone itself. He used to say that granite was the bones of the earth, and that cutting it was a sacred trust. He believed that everything built from this stone carried something of the quarry with it, some essence of permanence and strength that would endure long after the people who cut it were gone. "Will you help us build here?" Lenora asked. "Will you help us create what grandfather designed?" Solomon turned to face them, his old eyes bright with something that might have been memory or might have been hope. "I will help you until my last breath," he said. "Your grandfather saved my life once, many years ago, when I first came north with nothing but the clothes on my back and the scars of slavery on my soul. He gave me work when no one else would. He treated me like a man when most people treated me like property. I owe him a debt I can never repay. But I can help his grandchildren build the shelter he dreamed of. And maybe that will be enough." On December 23rd, Solomon gave them his final gift of knowledge. They were working on the animal shelter, fitting the last logs into place, when Solomon called them to the northern wall of the quarry. He was standing near the base of the shelter, near a section of granite that looked no different from any other section. "Your grandfather told me to show you this when the time was right," he said. "He buried something here years ago before the quarry flooded. He said it was insurance against a future he could not predict." He pointed to a spot at the base of the wall, where the granite met the quarry floor. "Dig there, carefully. Wait about 2 feet down." Lenora and Tobias and Gideon dug. The frozen earth resisted their shovels, but they worked slowly, carefully, aware that whatever waited below was important enough for their grandfather to bury and for Solomon to guard for years. At 18 inches, Tobias's shovel struck something hard. They cleared the dirt away with their hands, revealing a metal box about the size of a bread loaf, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box were three items. The first was a letter, written in their grandfather's careful hand, dated 3 years before his death. My dear grandchildren, if you are reading this, then you have drained the quarry, and Solomon has judged you ready to know the truth. I am proud of you beyond words. Inside this box, you will find two additional items. The first is a map showing the location of a vein of high-quality granite that runs beneath the eastern wall of the quarry. This vein is worth at least $40,000 at current prices, enough to make you wealthy beyond anything I could ever have provided. The second item is a set of documents that I have collected over 20 years. These documents prove that Harlan Voss forged my signature on 3 contracts in 1835, using these forgeries to seize 3 quarries that belonged to me. I attempted to take him to court at the time, but he had corrupted the judge, and my case was dismissed. I kept these documents hidden because I feared that revealing them would endanger you. Voss is a dangerous man, and he has destroyed everyone who has ever stood against him. But I also knew that someday you might need protection against him. Someday you might need leverage. Use these documents wisely. Voss fears exposure more than anything else. If he threatens you, remind him of what you hold. If he attacks you, use these documents to destroy him. But most importantly, be careful. He has harmed others before, though it was never proven, and he would do so again to protect his secrets. I love you both more than words can express. Build the shelter I dreamed of. Protect each other. And remember that your grandfather believed in you until his very last breath. Ezekiel Ashford. Lenora read the letter twice, her hands trembling. The map was detailed and precise, showing the location of the granite vein in relation to the quarry walls. The documents were even more damning than she had expected, when including original contracts with signatures that were obviously different from the forgeries Voss had used, sworn statements from witnesses who had since died, and a letter from a handwriting expert confirming that the forgeries were the work of a skilled criminal. Grandfather was protecting us, Tobias said quietly. Even after death, he was still protecting us. And now we can protect ourselves. Lenora carefully replaced everything in the metal box. We tell no one about this, not until we need to use it. They buried the box in a new location, beneath the floor of the storage building, where only they would know to look for it. And they continued building, preparing for the winter that everyone said would be the worst in a generation. Lenora now holds the power to destroy Harlan Voss completely. She has evidence of his crimes, proof that could send him to prison and restore everything he stole from her grandfather. But using that power carries risks. Voss is dangerous, and cornered men do desperate things. What would you do with such evidence? Would you use it immediately, or would you wait? Think about your answer before we continue. The storm arrived on February 3rd, 1856. Lenora woke that morning to a sky the color of iron, clouds so thick and low that they seemed to press down on the valley like a lid on a pot. The air tasted of metal, and the barometer Solomon had given them had dropped so far that she thought it might be broken. It is not broken, Solomon said when she mentioned it. He had moved into the quarry shelter a week earlier, after the cold became too much for his small cabin. He sat near the fire now, wrapped in blankets, his face gray with something more than age. The pressure is dropping because the worst storm I have ever seen is coming. We have perhaps 6 hours before it hits. How bad? Bad enough that people will die. Bad enough that this valley will never be the same. They spent those 6 hours preparing. Lenora and Tobias and Gideon hauled extra firewood into the shelter, stacking it against the walls until the supply seemed inexhaustible. They secured the animals, making sure the goats and chickens had food and water for several days. They reinforced the platform at the top of the stairs, adding extra planks to block wind and snow from the quarry below. Then the snow began to fall. It started gently, almost beautifully, fat white flakes drifting down from the iron sky, like feathers shaken from the wings of angels. Within an hour, it was falling so thick that Lenora could barely see her hand in front of her face. Within 2 hours, the wind arrived, howling through the valley at 50 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontally, creating drifts that grew with terrifying speed. By nightfall, the world had disappeared. The quarry became an island in a sea of white chaos. The granite walls blocked the worst of the wind, but the sound of it was constant, a roar that never stopped, pressing against the stones like something alive trying to break through. Snow piled on the platform at the top of the stairs, accumulating faster than they could clear it, building into a drift that would seal them in if they did not fight it constantly. They took turns through the night, one person shoveling while the others slept. The work was brutal, fighting against wind that tried to tear the shovel from their hands, digging through snow that filled back in almost as fast as they could remove it. By morning, Lenora's arms felt like they were made of stone, and her face was raw from the wind despite the scarf she wore. The storm continued. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. The snow fell without pause, without mercy, without any indication that it would ever stop. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill anyone caught outside without shelter. And then the survivors began to arrive. The first family came on the morning of the third day. The Brennan family, father and mother, and 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 12. Their cabin had collapsed under the weight of the snow, on the roof caving in during the night while they huddled together for warmth. They had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they had spent 6 hours struggling through chest-deep snow to reach the quarry. "Please," the father gasped, his face gray with frostbite. "Please help us." Lenora did not hesitate. She led them down the stairs into the quarry, into the warmth of the shelter, into a space that suddenly seemed smaller than it had been before. The children were crying, their hands and feet dangerously cold. The mother could not stop shaking. The father collapsed near the fire and did not move for hours. More families followed. The Kowalski widow with her 2 small boys. The Morgan family with their elderly grandmother. The Peterson family, including the 2 young boys who would later need saving. They came in ones and twos, in small groups and large ones, all of them fleeing homes that had failed them, seeking the one shelter in the valley that the storm could not touch. By the evening of the 4th day, there were 42 people living at the bottom of the quarry. Lenora organized them with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself. Work crews to dig the entrance tunnel each morning, fire tenders to keep the flames burning steady, child minders to watch the children, 11 of them under 10 years old, cooks to stretch the food supplies as far as possible. Everyone had a job, everyone contributed, everyone survived. Throughout that night and the following day, more survivors straggled in. Families from the far edges of the valley, the people who had spent days fighting through impossible snow to reach the one shelter everyone was talking about. And then, on the morning of the 5th day, Harlan Voss arrived. He came alone. Lenora found him at the top of the stairs, collapsed against the platform wall, barely conscious. His fine coat was crusted with ice. His silver hair was matted and wild. His fingers were blackened with frostbite, and his lips were the color of a winter sky. The great house on the hill, the finest house in the valley, had been destroyed on the 2nd day of the storm. An avalanche of snow had swept down from the mountain behind it, burying everything in its path. Voss had survived only because he had been in his stable checking on his horses when the slide came. He had spent 3 days wandering from shelter to shelter, when turned away by families who remembered how he had treated them when he held the power. Now he knelt in the snow before the woman whose grandfather he had robbed, whose future he had tried to steal, whose life he had threatened more than once. "Miss Ashford," he whispered. His voice was cracked and broken, the voice of a man who had finally run out of options. "I know I have no right to ask. I know what I have done to your family, but I have nowhere else to go. Please." The refugees in the quarry below had gathered at the base of the stairs looking up. They knew who Voss was. They knew his history. They waited to see what Lenora would do. Tobias stood beside his sister, his face unreadable. Solomon watched from the shelter doorway, his old eyes bright with something that might have been curiosity or might have been judgment. Gideon stood close to Lenora, his presence solid and reassuring, but he did not speak. This was her decision to make. Lenora looked at the man who had been her enemy, who had tried to destroy everything her grandfather had built. She looked at his blackened fingers and his frozen lips. She looked at his eyes, which no longer held calculation or cruelty, only fear and exhaustion, and something that might have been shame. She thought about her grandfather's letter. He has harmed others before, though it was never proven, and he would do so again to protect his secrets. She thought about the documents buried beneath the storage building, the evidence that could destroy Voss forever. She thought about what it would mean to leave him here, to let the storm do what she could not bring herself to do. He would die within hours. No one would blame her. No one would even know, except the people in the quarry, and they had no love for Harlan Voss. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, words he had spoken to her years ago on a summer evening when they sat together watching the sun set over the mountains. Strength is not about what you can destroy, Lenora. Strength is about what you can build, and mercy is about what you choose not to do, even when you have the power to do it. Come down, she said. There is room. Voss stared at her. For a moment she thought he might refuse, might let pride kill him where mercy would not. Then his face crumbled, and something broke behind his eyes, and he nodded without speaking. She helped him descend the stairs, supporting his weight when his legs threatened to fail. At the bottom, so she led him to a corner of the shelter, away from the fire, where the temperature was still warm, but where he would not take heat from people who had done nothing to deserve their suffering. He did not speak for the rest of that day. He sat in his corner and watched and listened and learned things about the people he had exploited for so many years. He saw how they cared for each other. He saw how Lenora organized them into a community that functioned better than any community he had ever controlled. He saw strength that had nothing to do with money or power, and everything to do with compassion and determination. By nightfall on the 5th day, 57 souls had found refuge at the bottom of the quarry. Lenora just let her worst enemy into the shelter that she built with her own hands. She had every reason to turn him away, and to let the storm take him, but she chose mercy instead of revenge. What would you have done? Think about your answer before we continue. The tunnel collapsed on the morning of the 6th day. Snow had been accumulating on the platform above the stairs, despite their constant shoveling. The weight became too great. The wooden supports groaned, then cracked, then gave way entirely. Lenora was inside the shelter when she heard the thunder of falling snow. She rushed to the entrance and found chaos. The tunnel that led from the quarry floor to the surface had collapsed, burying everything in its path. And 2 children were missing. The Peterson boys, 7 and 9 years old, had been playing near the tunnel entrance when it fell. Their mother was screaming their names, clawing at the snow with her bare hands. Other refugees joined her, digging frantically, but the snow was packed tight as concrete, and no one knew exactly where the boys had been standing. Solomon appeared beside Lenora, his old face set with determination. I know where they are, he said. I saw them before the collapse. They were near the eastern support beam. Solomon, you cannot. I know this quarry better than anyone alive. I know exactly where to dig. Before she could stop him, he was moving. He grabbed a shovel and began cutting into the snow with a precision that belied his age, carving a path toward a spot that looked no different from any other. Here, he called. Everyone dig here. They dug. Gideon worked beside Solomon, matching the old man's pace despite the years between them. Tobias directed the others, organizing the effort, making sure no one got in anyone else's way. Lenora dug until her hands bled, until her arms screamed, until she could not feel anything except the desperate need to reach those children. They found the first boy after 2 hours. Unconscious but breathing, his small body curled into a ball, protected by a pocket of air that had formed around the support beam. His brother was beside him, similarly protected, similarly alive. But the effort had cost Solomon everything. He collapsed as they pulled the second boy free, his hand pressed against his chest, his face gray with pain. Lenora caught him before he hit the ground, cradled his head in her lap, felt his heart stuttering beneath her palm. Solomon, Solomon, stay with me. His eyes found hers, and despite the pain, he smiled. Got them out, he whispered. Both of them. That is what matters. You need to rest. Or I need to go. His hand found hers, squeezed with surprising strength. Your grandfather is waiting for me. We have much to discuss. Solomon, please. Tell Tobias to keep reading. Tell Gideon to take care of you. And tell yourself. He paused, gathering breath that was becoming harder to find. Tell yourself that I am proud of you. Prouder than I have ever been of anyone. His eyes closed, his hand relaxed in hers. And Solomon Birch, who had survived slavery and loss and 68 years of hard living, finally rested. Lenora held him until his body grew cold, tears freezing on her cheeks, grief and gratitude tangled together in her chest. He had saved 2 children with his last breath. He had died exactly as he had lived. The storm broke on February 8th. The sun emerged for the first time in 6 days, revealing a valley transformed beyond recognition. Lenora stood at the rim of the quarry and looked out at a landscape that seemed to belong to another world. Houses had disappeared under white mountains. The church was a ruin, its roof collapsed under the weight of snow that no structure had been built to bear. Roads were invisible beneath drifts that would not fully melt until May. Trees that had stood for 100 years lay snapped like twigs, and the sound of silence was deafening after days of howling wind. The 57 people in the quarry emerged slowly, blinking in sunlight they had not seen since the world changed. Some wept when they saw what remained of their homes. Others stood in silence, unable to process the destruction that surrounded them. But all of them were alive, every single one, because 2 orphans had looked at a flooded pit and seen a shelter. The families began to leave over the following days, returning to salvage what they could from ruined homes, beginning the long process of rebuilding their lives. They thanked Lenora as they went, words that seemed inadequate to express what they felt. They promised to help her when spring came, to repay the debt they owed to the young woman who had saved them. They buried Solomon at the edge of the quarry, in a grave cut into the granite he had loved. The marker they made said, Solomon Birch, 1788 to 1856. He taught us that walls can hold warmth as well as they hold water, and that the measure of a life is not its length, but its gift. He saved 2 children with his last breath. He rests now with the stone he loved. Harlan Voss was the last to leave. He approached Lenora on the morning of February 10th, standing before her with none of his former arrogance. His frost-bitten fingers were wrapped in bandages. His face was haggard, marked by days of confronting truths he had spent his whole life avoiding. I need to speak with you, he said, privately. They walked to the edge of the quarry together, standing where they had stood months ago when he had offered her $120 for everything she owned. The quarry looked different now, no longer flooded, no longer worthless. It looked like what it was, a shelter that had saved 57 lives. I know about the documents, Voss said quietly. Your grandfather told me years ago that he had kept evidence of what I did. He warned me that someday it would come back to haunt me. Lenora did not respond. She simply waited. I spent 20 years thinking about those documents, wondering where they were, wondering when someone would find them. It is why I tried to buy this quarry. Not for the granite, though that is valuable too, but because I knew your grandfather had hidden something here, and I needed to find it before anyone else did. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, which he handed to her. This is a deed, he said. 100 acres surrounding this quarry. Land I have been holding for speculation, waiting for the right opportunity to develop it. It is yours now, free and clear. Why? Because your grandfather was right about me, about everything. Voss looked at the quarry, at the shelter that rose against the northern wall, at the wooden stairs that had carried 57 people to safety. Adule, I built my fortune on other people's suffering. I took what I wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in my way. I told myself that this was just how the world worked, that weakness deserved to be exploited and strength deserved to win. He turned back to face her, and his eyes were wet with something she had never seen in them before. But you showed me something different during that storm. You showed me that strength is not about taking. It is about giving. It is about protecting people instead of preying on them. You had every reason to leave me in the snow. I would have died, and no one would have blamed you. But you did not. You saved my life because it was the right thing to do. I did not do it for you, Lenore said. I did it because my grandfather would have done it. I know. And that makes it even more remarkable. He reached into his coat again and withdrew a second envelope. This is a confession, he said, signed and witnessed and notarized. It details everything I did to your grandfather. The forged contracts, the corrupted judge, the 3 quarries I stole from him, It also includes statements that will corroborate your grandfather's documents and ensure that no judge can ever dismiss them again. Lenora took the envelope but did not open it. What do you want in exchange? Nothing. I am leaving Ironstone Valley. I am leaving New Hampshire. I am going somewhere where no one knows who I am or what I have done. And I am going to try, for whatever time I have left, not to be a different kind of person than I have been. He looked at her with an expression that mixed grief and hope, and something that might have been the beginning of redemption. Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew, he said. I betrayed him because I was jealous of what he had. Not his money or his land, but his integrity, his ability to look at himself in the mirror without flinching. I destroyed him because I could not stand to see someone be so much better than me. You did not destroy him, Lenora said. He died believing that his work would continue. He died knowing that his grandchildren would finish what he started. You took things from him, but you never took the things that mattered. Voss nodded slowly. I understand that now. Too late to make amends, but not too late to stop doing harm. He turned to leave, and then stopped and looked back. The documents your grandfather buried, he said. I would burn them if I were you. Not because I deserve to escape justice, but because carrying that kind of weapon changes a person. I have seen it happen. The power to destroy someone corrupts even those who never use it. I will think about it, Lenora said. That is all I can ask. He walked away, moving slowly through snow that still lay thick across the valley. Lenora watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, until the only sign of his passing was a trail of footprints that the sun would erase by afternoon. Epilogue. 1862. Lenora stood at the edge of the quarry on a summer morning 6 years after the blizzard, watching sunlight play across the granite walls that had become famous throughout New Hampshire. The quarry was different now. The original shelter still stood against the northern wall, preserved exactly as it had been during the storm. But the families who had survived there had insisted on something more. They had gathered at the quarry one spring morning, 3 months after the blizzard ended, and unveiled a new sign carved from granite. Solomon's Haven, in memory of Solomon Birch, who gave his life so that others might live. Every year on February 3rd, the anniversary of the storm's beginning, survivors and their descendants gathered at the haven. They lit candles for those who had died in the valley. They shared stories about those who had lived, and they remembered the old man who had taught 2 orphans to see shelter where others saw only stone. New structures had risen around the original shelter. A proper house at the rim, built from granite blocks cut from the very quarry it overlooked. A workshop where Tobias, now 24, developed new techniques for construction and engineering, his mind as sharp as ever, his body finally grown into the strength that matched it. A small school where children learned reading and mathematics and the principles of geology that Ezekiel Ashford had spent his life studying. Gideon Hale stood beside Lenora, his hand resting on her shoulder, with the comfortable ease of a man who had been her husband for 4 years. He had proposed a month after the storm, when the snow was finally melting and the world was beginning to heal. She had accepted without hesitation, knowing that he was a man who understood what mattered and what did not. Tobias says the new drainage system is complete, Gideon said. The quarry will never flood again, no matter how much rain falls. Grandfather would be proud. Grandfather is proud. Wherever he is looking down at what you built and smiling. Lenora thought about Ezekiel Ashford, about the dreams he had carried for 20 years, about the faith he had placed in grandchildren he barely knew. She thought about Solomon Birch, teaching her to read granite and swing a hammer and see the world as something to be built rather than exploited. She thought about Harlan Voss, whose final gift had been a lesson in the possibility of change. She thought about the 57 people who had descended into darkness and emerged into light. And she thought about what it meant to inherit something worthless and transform it into something invaluable. The quarry stretched before her. It was shelter that had become a legacy. The walls caught the morning sunlight and held it like captured gold. At the bottom, the granite floor was smooth and cool, waiting for whatever came next. Some people looked at holes and saw nothing. Lenora had learned to see differently. The Ashford Quarry is still there, still surrounded by granite walls that block the wind and hold the temperature steady. The shelter Lenora built has long since been replaced by a museum that tells the story of the blizzard of 1856 and the people who survived it. Visitors come from across New England to stand at the bottom of the quarry and feel the constant coolness of the stone. They come to learn about geology and engineering and the remarkable properties of granite. But mostly they come to understand something simpler and more profound. They come to learn that the deepest holes sometimes offer the greatest protection, and that what one generation calls worthless, another generation might call salvation. The end. Final reflection. Lenora and Tobias inherited something that everyone said was worthless. They transformed it into something that saved 57 lives. Their story reminds us that value is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath obstacles that only patience and faith can overcome. What flooded pits have you been walking past without seeing? What worthless things in your life might be waiting for you to discover their true value?